Using a camera is all about controlling light. Understanding exposure is the first step into the world of photography and filmmaking. To be able to capture an image that's exposed correctly, you need to understand the three basic elements that control exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The aperture is the opening in the lens that allows light to enter the camera. Lenses have a series of blades inside them that open and close to control the size of this opening. A large opening will let lots of light into the camera. A small one will let less light in. Aperture is measured in f-stops, and the larger the aperture, the smaller the f-stop number is. When the aperture is set to f1.4, the opening on the lens is large. When it's set to f16, the opening is small. For each full stop that you open the aperture, going from a larger f number to a smaller one, the amount of light that enters the camera is doubled. For each full stop that you close the aperture, going from a smaller f number to a larger one, the amount of light is halved. Aperture doesn't only affect the amount of light entering the camera, it also affects the depth of field. But before understanding depth of field, you need to grasp the concept of focus. Basically, focus is the sharpest area of an image. Lenses are made of optical elements that move inside the barrel as you spin the focus wheel to bring the subject into focus. You set the focus by matching the distance the subject is from the camera to the markings on the lens. Depth of field is the amount of space in front of and behind the focus plane that's also in focus. When the aperture is wide open, the depth of field is shallow. This means that only a small portion of what's in front of and behind the focus plane will also be sharp. As you close the aperture, the depth of field increases and more of the image comes into focus. Having a shallow depth of field is a composition tool that allows you to isolate the subject from the background, directing the viewer's eye to the subject. Cameras have a curtain that covers the sensor, preventing light to come in. This curtain is triggered to lift when you press the shutter release button, exposing the sensor to the light coming in through the lens. Shutter speed is how long this curtain that covers the sensor stays open, determining the amount of light that's allowed to pass through and hit the sensor. Shutter speed is measured in seconds or fractions of a second. The longer the curtain stays open, more light is allowed to pass through and hit the sensor. You can halve the amount of light hitting the sensor by decreasing the shutter speed by a full stop, making the time that it takes for the shutter to open and close faster. You can double the amount of light by increasing the shutter speed a full stop, making the shutter slower. Different shutter speed settings will not only affect the amount of light coming into the camera, but also the amount of blur caused by movement. The sensor captures all the movement that happens while the curtain is open. If you have a slow shutter speed and the subject moves, the sensor will capture all of the movement. If the shutter speed is fast, the sensor will be exposed for a fraction of a second, allowing you to freeze the movement. Shutter speed can also be used as a composition tool, since it allows you to convey a sense of movement by either showing or freezing it. ISO is a light sensitivity rating that indicates the sensor's sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. When you double the ISO, going from 400 ISO to 800 ISO, the amount of light that the sensor can capture is doubled. When you have the ISO, going from ISO 400 to ISO 200, you have the amount of light that the sensor can capture. The higher the ISO setting, the more digital noise and grain you introduce into the image. Each camera has its own native ISO, which is the ISO that it performs best at. Each camera also reacts differently when you push it to higher ISOs. Different cameras will have different amounts of noise in the same ISO settings. Some perform better at high ISOs than others. The three elements of exposure can be used to balance each other out. Each full f-stop is equivalent to a full shutter stop, which is equivalent to a full ISO stop. You need to balance these three elements to have a correctly exposed image. All modern cameras have a light meter. When the light meter indicator is at 0, it means that the image is correctly exposed. When the number on the light meter is negative, it means that the image is underexposed. There is not enough light hitting the sensor. When the number is positive, positive, it means that the image is overexposed. There's too much light hitting the sensor. Say that you have an image that's correctly exposed when the aperture is at f5.6, the shutter speed at 60, and the ISO at 800, but you want a shallow depth of field at f2.8. The difference between f5.6 and f2.8 is 2 full stops. You need to compensate the exposure for the increase of light due to the wider aperture by either making the shutter speed faster, decreasing it by 2 full stops from 60 to 250, or lowering the ISO by 2 full stops, going from 800 to 200, to maintain the same correct exposure from the settings you started with. Another way you could compensate for this 2 full stops difference is by decreasing the shutter speed 1 full stop, going from 60 to 125, and decreasing the ISO 1 full stop, going from 800 to 400 ISO, and the image would also be correctly exposed. The 3 elements of exposure work together to create an image. It's important to understand how each of them work, how they balance each other out, and how they affect the image so that not only you have a correctly exposed photograph, but also an image that conveys the effect and emotion that you're trying to portray. The best way to learn these concepts and how they are connected is by being curious, experimenting with the settings, and taking a lot of photos. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.